Snow arrived in Lochdu the way it always did, soft at first, like a polite knock, then harder, insistent, until the village was sealed inside a white silence. By the time the welcome banner for the winter festival snapped loose from the lamppost, the roads were already slick, and the sea beyond the harbour lay dark and unmoving. It was meant to be a celebration, mulled whisky, a ceremonial first toast, and the arrival of winter tourists. Instead, it began with a scream that cut through the cold like a knife. Morag Mac Innes was found just after dawn in the foyer of the old guest house, the very place where visitors were supposed to be greeted with smiles and steaming cups of tea. She lay on her back beneath the antlered welcome sign, eyes open, lips faintly blue, her tartan shawl folded neatly over her chest, as if someone had taken care to make her presentable. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were bolted. Snow outside the threshold was untouched. Dr. Brodie arrived shaking his head before he had even knelt beside the body. "No wounds," he muttered. "No sign of a struggle. But she's been dead for hours." He sniffed the air, then frowned. "Smell that? Almonds." The word passed through the gathered villagers like a ripple. Poison, something secretive, deliberate. And yet Morag was not a woman with enemies. She ran the guest house with brisk efficiency, scolding tourists for muddy boots and locals for unpaid bills, but nothing that deserved murder. She had been alone the night before, or so everyone said. The winter welcome toast had been cancelled when the storm worsened, and Morag had volunteered to stay behind and keep the hearth going. Hamish Macbeth stood near the doorway, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his police jacket, his long face solemn beneath his red hair. He disliked snow. It made people tense, irritable, prone to foolishness. He disliked poison even more. It was tidy in a way that suggested planning, patience, and a cold sort of courage. He studied the foyer carefully. The welcome table still stood against the wall, 3 untouched glasses arranged in a precise line. One held whisky, amber and clear. One held water. The third was empty but faintly smelled of almonds. Hamish crouched and sniffed it himself, grimacing. "That's your culprit, then," he murmured. Though to him it raised more questions than answers. If Morag had poisoned herself, why set out 3 glasses? If someone else had done it, how had they entered and left a locked building without leaving a mark? The fire in the hearth had burned low but steady through the night. The kettle sat cold on the stove, unused. Everything suggested an evening cut short, frozen in time. Outside, the snow showed no footprints, no drag marks, no signs of disturbance. Inside, there was no disorder, no broken furniture, no hidden bottle or vial. The poison itself had vanished, leaving only its bitter ghost in the glass. It was as if death had politely introduced itself, stayed for a moment, and left without troubling anyone. Hamish questioned the villagers one by one. The answers were simple, almost too simple. No one had seen anything. No one had been inside after Morag locked up. No one had reason to harm her. Each statement slid neatly into place, forming a picture so smooth it made Hamish uneasy. Crimes, in his experience, were rarely tidy, unless someone wanted them to be. He returned to the body, noting small details others overlooked. Morag's hands were clean, nails unbroken. There were faint white crystals on the rim of the empty glass, barely visible, unless the light caught them just right. Sugar, perhaps, or something pretending to be. He straightened, eyes drifting to the welcome sign above her, its painted words cheerful and ironic against the gloom. The winter welcome toast had never been made, yet someone had prepared for it. 3 glasses, 3 drinks. As if Morag had been expecting company after all. Hamish felt the familiar prickle at the back of his neck, the sensation that came when a case refused to behave. Locked doors, no footprints, A woman dead in her own foyer, greeted by the very sign meant to promise warmth and safety. It was either the simplest crime imaginable, or something far more cunning than anyone in Loch Dhu wanted to admit. As the snow thickened outside and the village retreated indoors, Hamish knew one thing for certain: winter had been welcomed into Loch Dhu with a lie, and it was his job to find out who had raised the glass. Hamish stayed behind after the others drifted out, their breath steaming in the cold as they returned to their shops and cottages, whispering as they went. The guest house grew quieter with every passing minute, until only the tick of the cooling hearth and the distant groan of the wind remained. He liked it this way. People muddied things. Rooms, when left alone, tended to tell the truth. He began at the door. The lock was old but well cared for, its bolts sliding smoothly, no scratches around the frame. Locked from the inside, certainly, but locked after the last person entered. That detail mattered. He knelt and ran his fingers along the floorboards. Clean, too clean. Someone had swept them recently, even near the skirting where dust usually gathered. Not the sort of thing done in a panic, more like a habit. His gaze returned to the 3 glasses. He lifted them carefully, lining them up again. The whiskey glass was untouched, its surface unbroken by lips. The water glass showed a faint smear where someone had lifted it and set it down again without drinking much. The empty glass, however, had been used thoroughly. Hamish tipped it toward the light. The white crystals clung stubbornly to the rim, resisting the warmth of his breath. Sugar dissolved quickly. This had not. He sniffed again, then frowned. Almonds, yes, but also something sharper, metallic beneath it. Whoever had prepared that drink knew what they were doing, or at least thought they did. The glass itself was perfectly clean, polished like the others, except for that residue. A careless mistake in an otherwise careful plan. A faint sound made him glance up. From the corridor beyond the foyer came the softest creak, as if a floorboard had shifted. Hamish straightened slowly. "Anyone there?" he called, keeping his voice mild. Mrs. Calder, Morag's nearest neighbour, appeared in the doorway, clutching her shawl tight around her thin shoulders. Her eyes darted past Hamish to the body, then away again. "I thought I left my gloves here," she said too quickly. "Morag borrowed them last week." Hamish nodded and watched her hands. They trembled, not with cold, but with a nervous energy that didn't quite match her words. She scanned the room, her gaze lingering on the welcome table. When her eyes touched the empty glass, she swallowed. "They're not here, Hamish," said gently. "You can check the coat room if you like." She did not move. Instead, she blurted, "Morag didn't drink whiskey, gave her headaches." The words tumbled out, unprompted. "That's so?" Hamish replied. Funny, then, that she poured a glass. Mrs. Calder flushed. "Well, guests, you see. She always prepared for guests." She turned abruptly and hurried away before he could say more. Hamish watched her go, filing the reaction away. People often betrayed themselves not by what they said, but by what they volunteered. He made a note in his pocketbook, then continued his inspection. Near the welcome sign, something else caught his eye, a faint smear on the wall barely darker than the paint beneath it. He leaned closer. It smelled faintly of oil, not the sort used for lamps, but thicker, mechanical. His gaze dropped to the antlers mounted above the sign. One tine bore a matching dark stain. Someone had touched it with an unclean hand. Why touch the antlers at all? They were decorative, nothing more. Unless someone had used them to steady themselves, or to reach something. Hamish stepped onto a chair and examined the top of the sign. There, tucked behind the wooden beam, lay a folded scrap of paper, nearly invisible unless you knew to look. He unfolded it carefully. It was a torn piece of brown wrapping, the kind used by the village chemist. No writing, no label, just a corner ripped away. The routine-minded officers would have missed it. It wasn't obvious, and it didn't shout importance, but Hamish had learned that the smallest things often carried the loudest truths. He looked again at Morag, at the careful placement of her shawl, at the absence of struggle. This had not been a violent death. It had been intimate, controlled. Someone she trusted had been here, someone who knew her habits well enough to prepare the right glass and the wrong drink. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters as if impatient. Inside, the pieces were beginning to shift, ever so slightly, out of alignment. Not enough to reveal the full picture, but enough for Hamish to feel the first tug of certainty. This crime was not unsolvable. It was pretending to be. By midday the snow had eased, though the cold lingered like a grudge. Hamish gathered the villagers one by one, preferring to speak to them in familiar places where they felt most at ease. Truth, he believed, slipped out more readily when people thought they were on home ground. He began with Mrs. Calder, finding her in her kitchen with a pot of tea she had clearly forgotten to drink. She spoke quickly, eyes fixed on the table. She had gone home early the night before, she said, the roads turning treacherous, her knees aching in the cold. She had not seen Morag after dusk. She mentioned again, without being asked, that Morag disliked whisky. Hamish nodded, letting the silence stretch. Mrs. Calder filled it by explaining how Morag always insisted on keeping the guest-house welcoming even when no guests were expected. She'd never turn anyone away, she said, almost pleading. When Hamish asked why she'd gone back for her gloves that morning instead of later, her answer came a beat too late. Didn't want to forget, she said. Forgetfulness, Hamish thought, was rarely urgent. Next came Angus Grant, who supplied firewood to half the village. He met Hamish by the sheds near the harbour, breath fogging as he spoke. He had delivered logs to Morag the afternoon before, he said, just before the snow thickened. She'd been in good spirits, busy setting out the glasses for the welcome toast. Angus laughed at the memory. 3 of them, too. I joked she was expecting royalty. He swore he left before dark and went straight home. When Hamish asked if Morag had seemed worried about anything, Angus shook his head too vigorously. No, just the weather. Hamish filed away the detail about the glasses. Angus had mentioned them without prompting, just as Mrs. Calder had volunteered Morag's dislike of whisky. Patterns, he knew, often formed without intention. At the chemist's shop, Miss Fiona MacLeod stood stiffly behind the counter, hands clasped. She answered politely, precisely. Yes, she sold a variety of substances, some harmless, some not. No, she could not recall selling anything unusual recently. Her records were in order. Hamish asked about brown wrapping paper, torn corners. She frowned, then said many items were wrapped that way. Impossible to say. Yet when he mentioned the smell of almonds, her composure wavered, just slightly. Poisons are regulated, she said quickly. Very regulated. She did not meet his eyes. Hamish left with the sense that she was telling the truth as she understood it, but perhaps not the whole of it. At the pub, the atmosphere was heavier. Word had spread, and fear mixed freely with the ale. The regulars spoke over one another, eager to share what they knew, too eager. One man insisted Morag had argued with a stranger days earlier. Another claimed she'd been worried about money. None could agree on details. When Hamish pressed for specifics, times, names, exact words, the stories blurred and softened. Exaggeration, he thought, was its own kind of lie. One voice stood out for its restraint. Ewan Fraser, the handyman who helped maintain the guest house, spoke little and chose his words carefully. He admitted he'd been there early evening, fixing a loose shutter before the storm worsened. Morag had offered him tea. He declined. Didn't stay long, he said. She was waiting on someone. Someone specific? Hamish asked. Ewan shrugged. Didn't say, just said she had a welcome to prepare, even if the weather had other ideas. His eyes flicked briefly toward the door, as if measuring distance. Hamish felt a tightening in his chest. Another mention of waiting. Another confirmation that Morag had not expected to be alone. As the questioning continued, the contradictions grew more subtle but no less telling. Timelines overlapped imperfectly. Alibis were solid in isolation but thin when placed side by side. People remembered what suited them and forgot what didn't. Some leaned forward, desperate to be helpful. Others folded inward, guarding something small and precious. By late afternoon, Hamish returned to the guest house alone. The silence greeted him again, heavy and expectant. He stood by the welcome table, replaying the voices in his mind, each one a thread tugging in a different direction. Someone had been there last night. More than one someone, perhaps. They had spoken, shared a moment that ended in death. The case was no longer a blank wall. It was a tapestry with loose stitches, and Hamish could feel where to pull next. Beneath the careful stories and borrowed certainty, motive stirred, quiet, personal, and dangerous. Winter had not just arrived in Loch Dhu. It had found a way inside people, and it was whispering things they would rather keep buried. Hamish returned to his small office at the police station as the sky dimmed, snow drifting past the window like pale confessions. He spread out his notes across the desk, the faces and words of Loch Dhu's villagers staring back at him. Each had a motive, at least on the surface, but none could account for all the details. The locked door, the careful shawl, the poisoned glass, the hidden scrap of paper. The simplest explanations had begun to unravel, leaving only a maze of half-truths and hidden grudges. He started with Mrs. Calder. Her eagerness to speak, the repeated mention of Morag's dislike for whisky, the way she had returned for her gloves. Nothing violent in itself, yet there was a subtle tension in her words, as if she wanted to insert herself into the story. Perhaps pride, perhaps curiosity, but pride could also cover something deeper, something she was careful not to voice. She was a woman used to controlling her surroundings. Perhaps the guest house had always represented that control. Did she fear Morag's influence, or did she simply wish to protect herself from being implicated in a death she had no hand in? Then there was Angus Grant. Outgoing, jovial, yet overly precise about his movements. He claimed no knowledge of anything unusual, but he had emphasized the 3 glasses twice, unprompted. Was it simple recollection, or was he hinting at something he hoped Hamish would notice? Perhaps there was a debt, a slight or a moment of embarrassment that had festered. The question of whether he had delivered the poison instead of logs pressed at Hamish's mind, though nothing concrete tied him to the act. Still, someone had to have prepared the fatal drink, and knowledge of Morag's habits narrowed the field to those who observed her closely. Fiona Mac Leod's hands, stiff as boards, spoke of discipline and routine. Her slight hesitation at the mention of almonds lingered like smoke. She ran the chemist's shop. She knew what substances could kill, what effects they had and how quickly they acted. Could it have been her? Careless, curious, or vengeful? Or was she merely a person terrified of being wrongly accused, hiding behind the precision of her profession? Hamish considered the scrap of wrapping paper. The chemist's brown paper could have come from her shop, but it could have come from anyone. Yet why leave it tucked behind the sign, almost invisible? That small act suggested both awareness and guilt, or a deliberate misdirection. Ewan Fraser, the handyman, remained the most enigmatic. Quiet, observant, his admission of Morag waiting for someone suggested knowledge but not culpability. The careful way he spoke implied honesty, yet in a village as small as Loch Dhu, loyalty and fear often walked hand in hand. Did he know more than he let on? Had he been asked to stay silent, or had he chosen silence to protect someone else? His presence at the guest house that evening, though brief, now seemed significant, perhaps the last eyes on a scene that would never fully reveal itself unless someone slipped. Hamish considered the tangled web. Greed? Possible, but who would risk everything for a small inheritance or business advantage when death had already claimed Morag? Revenge? Perhaps if someone harbored resentment from the past, a slight long buried under polite conversation. Jealousy? Certainly plausible given the attentions the guest house attracted, both from villagers and visitors. Fear? Almost all of them displayed some measure, whether fear of accusation, exposure, or moral responsibility. Each motive alone was insufficient. Combined, they formed a maze with walls too high to see over, corridors that twisted back on themselves, and false doors leading nowhere. He leaned back, rubbing his temples. Sorting motives in isolation had been a starting point, but now connections demanded attention. Who knew whose schedule? Who had reason to be near the welcome table? Who had touched the antlers above the sign? Each thread seemed to intersect at multiple points, the overlapping reasons creating a confusing lattice. He realized that the truth might not lie in a single culprit, but in a sequence of choices, each influenced by knowledge, fear, and opportunity. Someone had orchestrated the evening carefully, anticipating who would act, what would be noticed, and what could be explained away. Hamish glanced at the empty glass again in his memory, the faint metallic tinge still haunting him. Whoever had delivered the poison had done so with precision, yet small missteps, the scrap of paper, the smear on the antler, had left traces for a keen observer. He knew that the answer would emerge from these imperfections, hidden within the contradictions of alibis and the half-truths of motives. The snow pressed harder against the windows, a relentless white sheet covering the village, yet inside the detective's mind, the outlines of the maze began to form. A thread here, a contradiction there. If followed carefully, it would lead to the centre where the real motive and the culprit waited. Someone in Loch Dour had welcomed winter with a deadly intent, and Hamish now knew that understanding the why was the key to discovering the how. The following morning, the village woke to a crisp sky, the snow sparkling under pale sunlight that made everything seem calm, almost cheerful. The police brought in the first of what they declared a breakthrough, a vial found hidden in a hollow of the firewood shed, labelled with the name of the chemist, Fiona Mac Leod. It contained traces of the same bitter almonds Hamish had smelled, enough to account for Morag's death. Excitement buzzed through the station as the authorities began drafting statements, imagining the case neatly closed, the culprit caught. Hamish, however, did not feel relief. He crouched by the door of the shed, examining the wood carefully. The vial was real enough, and the poison legitimate, but its placement seemed too convenient. It had been deliberately left where the first officer to inspect the shed would see it. Whoever had put it there had considered human curiosity and routine. The hand that planted the vial was thinking ahead, not panicking, not trying to hide, but leading someone like a shepherd guiding sheep. And shepherds were never the guilty party, they were manipulators. He asked Fiona to come in for questioning again. She arrived, her steps measured, eyes wary, lips pressed thin. "I did sell a small amount of bitter almond essence," she admitted. "For cooking, a flavouring, nothing more." She shook her head, repeating the mantra of her innocence. I had nothing to do with her death. Her fingers fiddled with the cuff of her sleeve, betraying her nerves. Hamish observed quietly. She seemed truthful, tense, yes, but the tension was protective, not guilty. The officers, meanwhile, had already begun telling the villagers that the case was nearly solved. Rumours spread quickly, whispers of the chemist's negligence transforming into accusations, the story gaining its own momentum. People nodded, satisfied that justice would be swift. Hamish watched them chatter, brows furrowed. Something about the excitement felt too neat, too satisfying. Crimes rarely wrap themselves up with a single tidy solution. Returning to the guest house, Hamish retraced the previous day's observations. He moved slowly, touching the edges of the welcome table, noting again the way the glasses had been arranged. His gaze lingered on the antlers above the sign. The faint smear, still visible, looked fresh. He knelt, noting the angle and pressure. Whoever had left it here had been careful but not meticulous, enough to leave a trace for a sharp observer. That kind of error was rarely accidental. He began to replay the voices of the villagers, thinking over each story. Mrs. Calder's eagerness, Angus Grant's repeated emphasis on the 3 glasses, Ewan Fraser's cryptic mention of someone Morag was waiting for. They were not villains in themselves, but they held pieces of a puzzle that no one else seemed interested in assembling. Someone was orchestrating the scene, guiding attention to the wrong suspect, while the real culprit watched the chaos unfold, concealed in plain sight. Hamish's instincts prickled. A false victory had been declared, yet the disquiet in his chest would not let him ignore the loose ends. The scrap of brown wrapping paper remained unexplained, the smear on the antler ignored by the officers. No one had considered the alignment of the glasses, the deliberate order, the empty glass that carried both poison and misdirection. The answers were staring them in the face, but the crowd's eagerness to pin blame on Fiona had blinded them. Outside, a shadow moved along the edge of the snow-laden street, pausing to glance back at the guest house before disappearing behind a wall of ice-encrusted trees. Hamish noticed it from the window, though no one else seemed aware. The figure was purposeful, deliberate, someone who had been watching all along, measuring reactions, timing steps. Whoever it was had no fear yet, confident that the excitement over the vial would keep suspicion away from them. He returned to the desk in his office, sifting through his notes and timelines again. He began mapping out who had access to the guest house, who knew Morag's habits intimately, and who had the knowledge to craft a death so neat that it seemed almost supernatural. The list narrowed, but the culprit remained elusive. Each step taken toward the supposed solution only reinforced the notion that the true criminal was still at large, hidden in plain view, capable of striking again if missteps were made. Hamish lit the small lamp on his desk, letting the glow illuminate the careful chaos of his notes. The false victory felt heavy, like a trap. The vial had distracted everyone, shifted focus, created a story that was easy to believe. Yet he could feel it in his bones. The case was far from over. The real criminal had left hints subtle and sly, expecting the ordinary to claim credit for their deeds, and the detective knew that the game had only just begun. Hamish sat alone that evening, the small lamp casting long, wavering shadows across the scattered notes and photographs on his desk. Outside, the wind rattled shutters as if urging him to hurry. He sipped the last of his cold tea and turned his attention once more to the scrap of brown wrapping paper he had found behind the antlers. It seemed insignificant at first glance, but something about the frayed corner gnawed at him. Why tuck it there? Why not leave it in the vial, or on the table? It was deliberate. And deliberate, Hamish knew, often meant a memory, a reference to something familiar to the culprit. He pulled open the village archives, an old, dust-scented room tucked behind the council hall. Records of minor incidents, disputes, and forgotten complaints lined the shelves. Most of them were trivial, lost sheep, unpaid rents, arguments over fishing rights. But Hamish scanned each entry with a keen eye, looking for patterns, for connections that might have been buried in the quiet routines of Lochdu. His fingers paused over a file labelled Mac Innes Grant, 1998. A cold curiosity settled over him. The case was minor at the time, a theft of supplies from the guest house managed by Morag's mother, and suspicion had fallen on Angus Grant. No charges had been pressed, as evidence had been circumstantial. Morag's family had quietly settled the matter, the incident fading into polite village memory. Hamish leaned back, connecting dots. Angus had been present in her life for decades, and Morag's diligence, inherited from her mother, had always irked him, an old rivalry buried under years of forced politeness. That explained some tension, perhaps, but not everything. He dug deeper and found another file, less obvious, a note about a minor dispute between Fiona Mac Leod and Morag, years ago, over a shipment of rare herbs. The chemist had accused Morag's mother of selling substandard products, a claim Morag had defended vehemently. Old grudges had a way of lingering, and Hamish began to see overlapping threads. The people he had questioned were not strangers. Their lives had intersected in subtle ways, driven by pride, resentment, and inherited obligations. The village, small and tight-knit, had a long memory despite its genteel calm. Returning to the guest house in his mind, Hamish traced the web of connections. Ewan Fraser, quiet and observant, had been employed by Morag's family on and off for years. He had seen disputes rise and fall, arguments pass silently, debts left unpaid. It was conceivable, Hamish thought, that Ewan had been privy to more than anyone realised, witnessing grudges mature into resentments, small slights that seemed forgotten but were never forgiven. He mapped the timeline in his notebook, connecting past and present. The 3 glasses, the locked door, the deliberate placement of the vial, they were not just acts of the present. They were echoes of old grievances, calculated lessons drawn from history. Someone had remembered who had slighted whom, who had been humiliated or denied, and had acted accordingly. The murder had roots deep in village life, reaching back decades, touching pride, rivalry, and long-simmering envy. Hamish's thoughts turned again to the subtle details he had noticed, the smear on the antlers, the scrap of wrapping paper, the choice of poison. Each was a deliberate signal, almost taunting, left by someone who knew how carefully Hamish, or anyone else, would examine the scene. It was a message from the past, carried forward in the guise of a tidy, controlled death. He realised with a growing sense of certainty that the culprit had chosen their victim not by chance, but because of the way past and present collided. Morag had been the linchpin in relationships forged long ago. Trusted, observed, sometimes challenged, the killer had moved through the village like a shadow, invisible, blending in, but motivated by a memory too sharp to ignore. Hamish felt the familiar thrill of progress, tempered by caution. The shadows of the past had illuminated the present, but the full truth was still obscured. The connections he had unearthed suggested not a single act of malice, but a network of subtle provocations, rivalries, and obligations. Someone had patiently waited, watching decades of interaction accumulate, then struck with precision. Outside, the village settled into night. Snow clung to the rooftops, muffling sounds and casting a quiet spell over Loch Dhu. Hamish looked out the window and considered the puzzle pieces, the old theft, the herbal dispute, the unspoken slights. The past was not gone, it was alive, threaded through the present, guiding the hand that had poured the fatal drink. The real criminal had long memories, patience, and a subtlety that few would suspect. And Hamish knew that understanding these roots would be key to revealing the killer before they had a chance to act again. Hamish spent the next morning pacing the guest house foyer, letting the silence settle around him like a comfortable cloak. He had reviewed the past, traced the threads of old grudges, and mapped the village's network of grudges and loyalties. Now he needed a clue that was not written in paper or testimony, something that would reveal character, the subtle tremor beneath a polished facade. Ordinary questioning had only produced half-truths. He needed to draw the guilty out with an unusual tactic. He set about arranging the foyer as though preparing for visitors, paying careful attention to the table where the 3 glasses had sat. He added a 4th glass, empty, and placed it slightly apart, as if someone had neglected it in their preparation. He then spread the other 2 glasses, one with water, one with whiskey, at slightly skewed angles, so that anyone entering the room would notice the subtle irregularity, an imperfection in what they believed to be a tidy scene. By mid-morning, Mrs. Calder appeared, ostensibly to check on the guest house. Hamish welcomed her politely, letting his hands gesture toward the glasses. "Odd, isn't it?" he said casually, as if to himself. "I've been trying to imagine who would leave them like this. The odd one set apart, almost like a signal." Her eyes flicked immediately to the 4th glass. A faint twitch of her lips, a flash of hesitation. She smiled politely, but Hamish noted it was the kind of smile that came with self-consciousness, the one worn to hide a secret awareness. He pressed no further, speaking of trivialities instead, letting her imagination fill in the blanks. Later, he asked Angus Grant to come along, ostensibly to move some firewood for the guest house. As Angus lifted the logs, Hamish casually mentioned the arrangement of the glasses and the curious attention to detail required to place them so precisely. Angus's laughter was too loud, too eager, and it faltered when Hamish allowed a silence to hang. "Funny," Angus muttered, adjusting the whiskey glass with the back of his hand. "I wouldn't think anyone would notice something so small." Yet he noticed. Too much. Hamish's intuition hummed. Both Mrs. Calder and Angus had reacted to the manipulation, not overtly, but in the micro-movements of hands, shifts in posture, the split-second catch in their eyes. Someone knew the importance of small details. Someone who understood how these little signals could be used to communicate or misdirect. The final test, Hamish decided, would involve Ewan Fraser. He asked Ewan to assist him in carrying a stack of firewood from the shed to the guest house. As they moved, Hamish pointed out a subtle trace on the floorboards, the faint smear he had noticed before near the antlers. "Curious," he said, letting his voice trail, "that someone would leave such a telltale mark and yet think no one would notice." Ewan froze, one hand gripping the log a fraction too tightly. His eyes flicked quickly toward the antlers, then back to Hamish. A blush crept across his cheek, not of shame exactly, but of discomfort, of awareness that he had been seen. "Could have been anything," Ewan muttered, shrugging, though his hands betrayed the tension as they shifted the logs almost aggressively. Hamish watched him closely, noting the subtle crack in his composure. Neither Mrs. Calder nor Angus had shown that level of unease when the floorboards were mentioned, and Fiona had not been present to react at all. Ewan's reaction suggested direct involvement, or at the very least a knowledge of the crime that he had not yet admitted. He had watched, he had understood, and now the test had forced a reaction too small for anyone else to notice, yet unmistakable to Hamish. The detective allowed the moment to linger, letting Ewan stew in the minor exposure. Human nature, he knew, often revealed the truth in the quiet spaces between words, in gestures too fleeting to be faked. And now, finally, the first significant crack had appeared, a hint of panic, a whisper of guilt, something that had been invisible to everyone but Hamish. As Ewan carried the last logs inside, Hamish's mind raced. The unconventional tactic had worked. He had not asked for confessions, nor pressed accusations, nor exposed the suspect to pressure. He had manipulated the environment, introduced subtle inconsistencies, and observed reactions. And in that reaction, he had found the thread that could unravel the deception. Outside, the snow fell steadily, covering Loch Doon quite white, but inside the guest house, the shadows were shifting. One of them was no longer hidden. The game had changed, and Hamish knew he was closer than ever to discovering who had welcomed winter with deadly intent. Hamish had barely returned to the station when the call came. The officers sounded tense, voices tight and hurried over the phone. A crucial piece of evidence, the scrap of brown wrapping paper he had found tucked behind the antlers, was gone. It had been stored in the evidence locker, catalogued and secured, but now it had vanished without a trace. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no explanation. Just gone. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow outside. Someone had acted deliberately, watching the investigation as closely as he did, and they had removed the one item that might have linked the present crime to its hidden roots in the past. Whoever it was understood the significance of small details, and they knew Hamish would see their absence immediately. Returning to the guest house, he examined the antlers again, almost expecting to find a replacement clue, a new signal. The faint smear of oil remained, subtle yet insistent, and he traced it again with his fingers. The thief, or the person covering their tracks had been careful, but nothing could erase the memory of the way the glass had been used, the positioning of the drinks, the micro-movements of those who had been present. Hamish's mind raced through possibilities. Could it have been Mrs. Calder, eager to insert herself into the investigation, yet willing to remove evidence to protect someone she cared about? Or Angus Grant, brash and proud, thinking himself clever enough to redirect suspicion? Perhaps Ewan Fraser, whose small crack under scrutiny had already revealed awareness of the crime, was now trying to erase traces before Hamish could follow the thread further. Even Fiona Mac-Leod, though calm and precise, had the knowledge and opportunity to remove something quietly. He began to reconstruct the timeline in his mind. The wrapping paper had been discovered after the vial appeared in the shed, after the villagers had begun celebrating their perceived breakthrough. The thief must have acted quickly when attention was elsewhere, knowing that the authorities would be too eager to declare the case solved. The speed and discretion of the act indicated planning, patience, and confidence, a hallmark of someone who knew the system and had watched its routines for years. Hamish returned to the station to examine the locker, scowling at the way it had been left ajar for only a brief moment, just long enough for someone to slip in and remove the paper. The logs confirmed no one had used the evidence room since it was catalogued. That meant the person had either a key, a copied key, or a moment of perfect opportunity while the officers were distracted. Access narrowed the circle further, but it also suggested that whoever it was had been confident in their knowledge of his methods. They weren't just destroying evidence, they were taunting him. He thought back to Ewan's reaction to the unconventional test, the way his hands had tensed, the slight flush across his face. If Ewan had taken the paper, it would explain the mixture of nervousness and awareness, the subtle attempts to misdirect. But then again, it could have been someone else entirely, using the same knowledge of timing and habits to remain invisible. Hamish couldn't rely on instinct alone. He needed proof, a crack in the armour of the deception. That night, he returned to the guest house once more, walking slowly through the familiar rooms. The shadows stretched long under the flickering lamps, and he noticed small details he had previously overlooked: a faint smear near the doorframe, a subtle scuff on the floorboards, the slight tilt of the welcome table that no one had moved. Someone had been here since the death, someone who knew what to disturb and what to leave untouched. Hamish's jaw tightened. The theft of the evidence changed everything. The investigation was no longer simply about finding the killer. It was about anticipating a mind that was always one step ahead. Trust in the village had become fragile. Each neighbour could be a witness, an accomplice, or the perpetrator themselves. Every conversation, every casual remark might conceal a deeper layer of deception. As he stared out at the snow-blanketed streets, Hamish realised the killer, or someone protecting them, was active again, reshaping the trail even as he followed it. The stakes had risen, and the subtle web of clues he had been unravelling was now threatened with erasure. Whoever had removed the paper had done so with the knowledge that Hamish would notice, and the detective knew, with the certainty that had served him for years, that the game had grown far more dangerous. The night deepened, and the village lay under a blanket of white silence. Inside, Hamish's mind raced, tracing the possibilities, cataloguing every gesture and glance he had observed. The evidence might vanish, but the truth had a stubborn persistence. Someone had tried to bury it, but the detective was watching, and shadows, no matter how cunning, always left their marks. The next morning, the village woke to a silence more tense than the snow itself. Hamish arrived at the station to find a flurry of commotion. Ewan Fraser had vanished. His small cottage on the edge of Lochdu was empty, doors unlocked, belongings untouched, save for a single note pinned to the table with a kitchen knife. The handwriting was tight, almost mechanical. "Stop following shadows, or someone else will pay the price." A chill settled over Hamish. This was no longer a simple case of murder. It had become a game. Someone was daring him to act, manipulating the investigation with precision, pulling strings from the shadows. Ewan's disappearance was not random. It was strategic, a warning, and perhaps a setup. He went immediately to the guest house, retracing the steps of the previous days. The welcome table remained slightly askew, the faint smear on the antlers still visible. Hamish crouched to examine the floorboards near the door. There, in the thin layer of undisturbed snow tracked into the foyer, he noticed something odd, a single boot print, smaller than Ewan's, leading toward the back door and disappearing into the snow. Whoever had taken Ewan had left just enough to hint at their presence without revealing their path. Hamish's mind raced, replaying every conversation, every subtle movement. Ewan's reaction to the unconventional test, the flush, the tension, the micro-gestures, took on new significance. He had known too much, been too observant. Perhaps he hadn't acted. Perhaps the true culprit had taken him before Hamish could unravel the web further. He called Fiona MacLeod to the station, needing her perspective on the missing paper, the poison, and Ewan's knowledge. She arrived quickly, cheeks pink from the cold, hands trembling slightly. Hamish presented her with the timeline and the reactions he had noted. "Someone removed the evidence," he said quietly. "And now Ewan is gone. It's no longer just about solving Morag's murder. It's about preventing another." Fiona's lips parted, but she said nothing at first. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Do you think it was planned? From the start?" Her eyes met his, wide, searching, as though she feared the answer. Hamish nodded slowly. "Yes. Everything. Morag's death, the vial, the missing paper. It's part of a sequence. Someone is orchestrating it, guiding our attention while staying several steps ahead." As they spoke, the station phone rang sharply. The dispatcher's voice trembled. Another alert. The chemist's shop had been broken into overnight. Nothing was stolen, but drawers had been rifled through, papers scattered, shelves disturbed. Whoever was behind the first murder, and now the disappearance, was testing boundaries, making themselves known while remaining hidden. Hamish and Fiona left the station together, walking carefully through the snow toward the shop. The tracks outside were almost obliterated by fresh flurries, leaving only fragments, a hint of movement. Hamish crouched to examine them. 2 sets of prints overlapped near the door, one adult, one smaller, almost delicate, then diverging into the snow, vanishing at the edge of the village. A trail, but one designed to mislead. Back inside the shop, Hamish scanned the ransacked shelves. Nothing appeared missing, yet a sense of menace lingered in the air. Someone had been here to send a message, and the message was clear: Hamish was being watched. Every move he made, every inference drawn, could provoke a reaction. This was no longer a retrospective investigation. It was active, urgent, and personal. He thought again of the scrap of brown paper, the smear on the antlers, the empty glass, the subtle reactions of those around him. Each clue had been part of a story, and now that story had shifted, the plot twisting violently in the present. Whoever was orchestrating this had anticipated every expectation, every routine, every human tendency to assume neat conclusions. Outside, the wind picked up, sweeping the village streets with a white blur. Hamish knew the game had changed. The killer, or whoever was orchestrating the chaos, was escalating, willing to abduct, threaten, and manipulate to stay ahead. Realized that the next step could not be reactive. He had to predict, to set traps of observation, to anticipate what the culprit might attempt next. The detective stood for a long moment in the cold shop, eyes scanning the disorder, mind-mapping possibilities. The stakes had risen. Morag's death had been the first move, Ewan's disappearance the second, and the message was unmistakable. Someone was still several steps ahead, and Loch Dhu would not see peace until Hamish uncovered the mind behind it. The snow pressed against the windows like a curtain, hiding secrets, concealing danger, but Hamish Macbeth, as always, was ready to pierce the veil. Hamish returned to the guest house that evening, the wind rattling the shutters as if impatient to share its secrets. The village lay blanketed in snow, deceptively calm, but he sensed the pulse of something hidden, a rhythm beneath the white silence that had eluded him until now. He spread his notes across the welcome table, reviewing the timelines, the statements, the small reactions he had observed in every villager. The theft of the paper, Ewan's disappearance, the broken order of the glasses, all of it had seemed chaotic, yet he could feel the faint tug of a pattern beginning to emerge. He looked again at the 3 glasses: water, whiskey, and the empty one with the bitter almond residue. The unusual thing, the detail that had never fully made sense, was the positioning. Each glass had been slightly misaligned, as if placed by someone who understood the significance of imperfection. The first time he had noticed it, he dismissed it as carelessness. But now, after Ewan's reaction to his unconventional test, after the missing paper, after the intrusions at the chemist's shop, the deliberate nature of these small discrepancies became clear. They were signals, subtle, psychological, designed to manipulate perception. Hamish's eyes moved to the antlers above the welcome sign, the faint smear of oil, the finger traces, the hidden scrap of brown paper. All of it had been left as breadcrumbs, a trail meant to provoke the right reactions at the right moment. And the key to reading it had been in the way people responded to these breadcrumbs. Mrs. Calder's twitch, Angus's laughter that faltered under silence, Ewan's tense hesitation, each one revealed knowledge, awareness, and motive, even if they tried to conceal it. He returned to the statements he had taken earlier, rereading them with this new lens. The repetition of certain details, who had delivered the firewood, who had noticed the arrangement of the glasses, who had been waiting for someone, suddenly aligned. The culprits had relied on human predictability, the inclination to over-explain, to fill silence with unnecessary information, to focus on one detail while overlooking another. Hamish realized the pattern was not just in the crime itself, but in the reactions it provoked. The real killer had known exactly how people would respond, and had used that knowledge to mislead and manipulate. A faint smile touched his lips as he recalled the smallest, almost forgotten detail, the way Morag had insisted on preparing 3 drinks for the winter welcome, even when she had no guests, and the way she had carefully left 1 empty glass. That act, seemingly mundane, had created the perfect stage for misdirection. The glass had become both a lure and a mirror, reflecting the intentions and reactions of those who entered the room. It had been a trap in plain sight, and the responses it elicited had been the key all along. Hamish thought of Ewan, his small crack under scrutiny, the tension when the smear on the antlers was mentioned, his careful observation of the unusual placement of objects, all pointed to him being more than a passive witness. He had known too much, understood the subtle choreography of the crime, yet remained constrained, perhaps by loyalty or fear. The puzzle pieces of Ewan's behaviour, Mrs. Calder's eagerness, and Angus's nervous exaggerations now formed a coherent picture. The killer had moved within this web, anticipating every human flaw and using it to cover their tracks. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the snow-covered streets of Loch Dhu. The pattern was no longer invisible. Every gesture, every tiny misalignment, every reaction had been part of a calculated sequence designed to control the narrative. The killer had orchestrated not just the death of Morag, but the chaos that followed, exploiting old grudges, personal knowledge, and human predictability. For the first time, Hamish felt the rhythm of the case in his mind, a steady pulse beneath the apparent disorder. The clues, the stolen evidence, the disappearances, they were all part of a larger design, and the key to breaking it lay in understanding the deliberate subtleties that had gone unnoticed. The truth had been in plain sight all along, hidden in the tiny, almost imperceptible details, and now that he had recognized the pattern, he knew exactly where to focus next. The village was quiet. but Hamish's mind raced. The killer remained active, intelligent, and several steps ahead, but the detective could finally see the threads that tied each action together. The pattern was clear, and with it, the path toward revealing the mind behind the deadly winter welcome had begun. Hamish spent the early hours of the morning retracing every interaction, every subtle gesture he had witnessed over the past week. The village slept under a blanket of snow, but his mind was wide awake, threading together the final pieces of the intricate puzzle. Every detail he had once dismissed as trivial now spoke to him with urgent clarity. The positioning of the glasses, the smear on the antlers, the reactions of those around him. He understood the pattern, and now he needed to uncover the heart that had driven it. Returning to Ewan Fraser's abandoned cottage, Hamish carefully examined the small room, now quiet and empty. Drawers had been moved, but nothing of great value appeared missing. Yet a faint smell of whiskey lingered in the air, subtle, bitter, and deliberate. It reminded him of the glass at the guest house, the carefully measured dose, the invisible cruelty hidden in routine. Then his eyes settled on a small notebook left on the desk, almost overlooked. The pages were filled with meticulous notes on Morag, her habits, the villagers, and, most strikingly, her family history. Ewan had chronicled every minor interaction, every slight, and every perceived injustice dating back decades. Reading further, Hamish felt a chill creep up his spine. This was not about money, nor about petty rivalry. The motive was far more personal, far more intimate. Ewan had grown up in the shadow of Morag's family, constantly measured against them, always considered helpful but never truly valued. The notebook revealed his simmering resentment at a life spent observing others achieve recognition, respect, and affection while he remained invisible. But it was not mere envy. It was a sense of betrayal, of being excluded from the very community he served, of being forced to witness what he could never have. And then the revelation struck him fully. Morag had been a symbol of that exclusion. Her diligence, kindness, and careful stewardship of the guest house were not just duties, they were reminders of what Ewan could not claim for himself. The crime had been meticulously planned, not as an act of impulse, but as a statement, a calculated exertion of control. By removing the scrap of paper, misaligning the glasses, and orchestrating reactions from the villagers, he had created a world in which he could manipulate perception, bend others to his will, and finally assert the power that life had denied him. Hamish felt the threads of manipulation stretch even further. The subtle smears, the missing evidence, the intrusions at the chemist's shop. They were not just distractions, they were a performance, a demonstration of intellect, patience, and dominance. Ewan had wanted to show, without overt confession, that he understood human behavior better than anyone else, that he could shape reality with a few small gestures, a few carefully timed absences, and the right manipulation of attention. It was the psychology behind the crime that was most shocking. The crime itself was secondary to the need to prove superiority, to command control over the environment and the people within it. Morag's death was both a personal act of retribution and a stage on which to exhibit mastery over the web of social interactions she had long orchestrated with casual grace. Every small detail, every reaction he had elicited, had been part of a lesson he intended to impart, one that validated years of silent observation, suppression, and frustration. Hamish paused, staring out at the snow-covered streets of Loch Dhu. He realized why Ewan had chosen the methods he had. The deliberate, almost theatrical manipulation of evidence, the psychological games, the careful removal of crucial items. They were not mere technicalities. They were manifestations of a mind obsessed with control, a mind that craved recognition in the only way it knew how, through subtle mastery of circumstance, through orchestrated chaos, and through proving, to himself at least, that he was never invisible. Understanding the motive crystallized the entire case. The seemingly erratic actions, the misdirections, the disappearance, they were all expressions of a psyche that demanded validation above all else, and which was willing to kill to claim it. Hamish knew that confronting Ewan would require both strategy and patience. The man had shown himself capable of careful planning, and impulsive action would only play into his hands. Yet in the clarity of this revelation, Hamish felt a rare surge of resolve. The villain's psychology, once hidden behind layers of routine, habit, and deception, was now exposed. The puzzle was not just a crime to be solved, it was the unveiling of a mind, and understanding that mind meant the final step toward ending the deadly winter welcome before it could strike again. Hamish spent the remainder of the day quietly preparing. Every step, every movement, every word was calculated. The snow outside fell steadily, muffling sound, blanketing Loch Dhu in a deceptive calm. He knew Ewan would not act recklessly. The man's intelligence and patience had been evident from the outset. To force a confrontation, Hamish would need a trap that drew on Ewan's desire to control the scene, to manipulate perception one last time. He returned to the guest house moving slowly, as if simply performing a routine inspection. The 3 glasses remained on the table, water, whiskey, and the empty one. Hamish deliberately adjusted them slightly, misaligning them in a way he knew would catch Ewan's attention. Then, with meticulous care, he left the scrap of brown wrapping paper pinned conspicuously behind the antlers, just as it had been found before. Every element was a lure, calculated to provoke the same compulsion to observe, to correct, to manipulate. Hours passed. Snow drifted against the windows, but inside, Hamish remained vigilant. Then, at the faintest sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside, he knew the moment had arrived. Ewan entered quietly, eyes scanning the room, noting the subtle misalignments, the paper in its conspicuous position. His expression shifted between satisfaction and apprehension. He knew he was being watched, yet could not resist the temptation to impose his own order on the scene. "Careful with that," Hamish said calmly, voice even, steady. He stepped into the doorway, blocking Ewan's path to the table. The tension tightened immediately, a taut string ready to snap. Ewan's hands, which had already moved toward the glasses, froze mid-air. "Hamish," he said quietly, almost admiringly. "I wondered how long it would take you to notice." Hamish kept his gaze steady, letting the silence hang, allowing Ewan to feel the weight of his observation. "It wasn't difficult," Hamish replied softly. "Once you stop looking at the obvious and start noticing the little things." He allowed his eyes to sweep over the man, the careful movements, the subtle twitch of his fingers, the small, deliberate breaths meant to control his own tension. "I think I understand why you did it." Ewan's lips curled into a faint, ironic smile. "Understand?" he echoed. "You think you understand a lifetime of being ignored, of being invisible? You think anyone could know what drives a man like me?" His voice hardened, but beneath the bravado there was a flicker of something else. Uncertainty, a crack in the mask he had worn so long. Hamish stepped closer, measured, calm, unthreatening but unyielding. "You wanted control," he said. "Not money, not revenge. The other pieces, the vial, the glasses, the paper, they were distractions. The truth was never about them. You wanted to show everyone in your own way that you weren't invisible, that you could orchestrate events, even death, and no one would see until you allowed it." Ewan's eyes flickered, a shadow of recognition crossing his face. "And if I admit it?" he asked, voice low. "If I confess, then it ends," Hamish replied. "You won't disappear, and no one else will be harmed. You know you're out of time. You've been patient, clever, careful, but the pattern was clear, and I've anticipated your next move." For a heartbeat, Ewan remained silent, measuring, calculating. Then, almost imperceptibly, his shoulders slumped. The tension in the room shifted. He laughed softly, bitterly. "So you see me," he said, shaking his head. "You've taken all the theatre from my hands." He moved toward the door, then paused, hands trembling slightly. "But you can't know everything. There are things you'll never understand." Hamish did not move. "I know enough," he said evenly. "Enough to prevent anyone else from being hurt. Enough to ensure that the truth comes out." Ewan's glance darted to the window, to the snowy streets outside, as though weighing an escape. For a moment it seemed he might attempt flight, a last desperate move. Then he exhaled, slowly, deliberately, and sank into the nearest chair. The fight drained from him, replaced by a strange resignation. "I suppose," he began, voice barely audible, "I suppose the game is over." Hamish approached, placing a steady hand on the man's shoulder, not forceful, just reassuring. "It's over," he said quietly. "And you won't have to be invisible anymore. Just honest." Ewan nodded slowly, finally meeting Hamish's gaze. The tension that had gripped the room for days, weeks even, seemed to release, like snow melting from a roof edge. The final confrontation had not required force nor threats. It had required patience, observation, and understanding the mind behind the crime. And now, for the first time, Hamish Macbeth could see the entire truth laid bare, the deadly winter welcome brought to its quiet, inevitable conclusion. The morning after Ewan's surrender, the village seemed almost peaceful, the snow glinting in the pale sunlight, reflecting a quiet calm that belied the chaos of the past week. Hamish returned to the guest house to finalize his notes, retracing the sequence of events and confirming that every detail now fit neatly into place. Or so he thought. Ewan had confessed, explained the motive, and revealed the careful manipulations that had misled the villagers. Yet Hamish felt an itch in the back of his mind, a faint unease he could not ignore. He wandered through the foyer again, inspecting the 3 glasses, water, whiskey, and the empty one, with the faint traces of bitter almonds. Everything seemed settled, the scene reconstructed, the evidence catalogued. Yet as he reached for the antlers, he noticed something subtle, a small smudge on the underside of the left tine, a mark he had not recorded before. It was faint, easily overlooked, but deliberate. Someone had touched it after Ewan's departure. Hamish's instincts prickled. He moved quietly through the guest house, noting small disturbances, a footprint near the rear door that did not match Ewan's shoes, a faint scuff on the rug by the fireplace, and a single strand of hair caught on the edge of a chair. None of it fit Ewan's account. He crouched to examine the hair, noticing its unusually light, almost silvery tone. Fiona MacLeod? Mrs. Calder? He couldn't tell immediately, but the evidence suggested one thing: someone had been back in the house after he believed the danger was over. He went to the station to compare the strands against the hair samples he had collected previously. While the officers filed paperwork on Ewan, Hamish slipped into the lab. The strand matched Mrs. Calder. Hamish's mind raced. She had seemed eager to help, cooperative in questioning, almost anxious to insert herself into the investigation. And yet, this subtle intrusion, after Ewan had confessed, suggested a more calculating hand, a final act, perhaps to secure her own ends or ensure the narrative remained under her control. Hamish returned to the guest house, eyes scanning the foyer as if the walls themselves might betray a secret. He laid out the glasses once more, placing the scrap of brown paper back behind the antlers. Then he waited. Hours passed. Shadows lengthened across the floor. And then, as the dusk settled, the door creaked. Mrs. Calder stepped inside, casual at first, but her eyes flickered to the table, to the paper, to the glasses. Hamish remained seated in the corner, quietly observing. Her hand hovered, almost imperceptibly, over the paper. "I just wanted to make sure nothing was left behind," she said, voice light, as if explaining herself to a friend rather than the detective. Hamish remained silent. The small twitch of her fingers betrayed the truth. She had been here before, and she had been taking notes, checking the layout. ensuring that Ewan's confession did not erase her own subtle influence on events. "You've been careful," Hamish said softly, breaking the silence. "Very careful. But subtlety isn't invisible. I noticed the antlers, the footprint, the strand of hair, and I know you were here after Ewan confessed." Mrs. Calder's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, then narrowed as she composed herself. I was just curious," she murmured. "You know, making sure the scene was preserved. To help." Her hands trembled slightly, and Hamish's gaze did not waver. "Curiosity," he said quietly, "that almost cost another life." He leaned forward. Ewan was only the instrument. Someone else orchestrated the environment, manipulated attention, and ensured the chaos played out. "And you were a silent partner in that orchestration, weren't you? The final act, ensuring the pattern remained intact after the confession." Her composure faltered, and she glanced toward the window, toward the snow-covered streets outside. Hamish could see the conflict in her eyes, fear, pride, and the instinct to preserve control. He waited, letting the silence press on her as it had pressed on others before. Finally she exhaled, small and reluctant, and sank into a chair. "I didn't touch the vial," she whispered. I just wanted to see if anyone noticed, to see how it would play out. Ewan, he's clever, but he's predictable. I just wanted to watch him dance." Her confession hung in the air, chilling in its calm calculation. Hamish leaned back, letting the revelation settle. The last-minute twist was clear. Ewan's motive had been the heart of the crime, but Mrs. Calder had been a hidden manipulator, orchestrating the peripheral details, guiding perception, and ensuring that chaos and suspense were maximized. The mastermind's reach had extended beyond the apparent culprit. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the village in a deceptive calm, while inside, Hamish Macbeth surveyed the scene. The case was finally complete, yet the final revelation reminded him that even in a quiet village, human nature could weave layers of deception, subtle and dangerous, that required patience, observation, and unyielding insight. Untangle. And he knew, with the certainty that had guided him through every twist and turn, that justice had been served, not through force but through understanding the minds behind the winter's deadly welcome. The village of Lochdew had settled into an uneasy calm by the time Hamish left the guest house that evening. Snow lay thick on the rooftops, muffling footsteps and softening the world in a deceptive serenity. Ewan Fraser had been taken into custody. His meticulous confession and psychological profile recorded, his motive laid bare. Mrs. Calder's final revelation had added a layer of complexity, exposing the hidden orchestration that had allowed the chaos to unfold. Yet despite the arrests and confessions, Hamish could not shake the feeling that the case was not yet fully closed. He walked slowly through the streets, boots crunching softly on the snow. Each house, each shuttered window, seemed to whisper hints of the past week's events. He paused outside Morag's guest house, staring at the welcome table through the frosted glass. It had been the stage for subtle manipulations, each element chosen with precision. The water glass, the whiskey, the empty one, each held significance, both as instruments of misdirection and as markers of the killer's control over perception. He ran his finger along the ledge, tracing the faint smear on the antlers once more, now understanding that the mark had been left deliberately to test whether anyone would notice. Inside the station, Hamish gathered the officers and villagers who had been involved, reconstructing the series of events in careful detail. He spoke slowly, pointing out what had been missed at first glance: the misplaced firewood, the scuff on the floorboards, the subtle interactions between Ewan and those he observed over the years. Most people saw the crime as a singular act, Hamish explained, a murder for attention, revenge, or greed. But the real story was in the micro-details, the small misalignments, the reactions they provoked, and the hidden history that connected the villagers. The criminal relied on the predictability of human behavior to hide in plain sight. He paused, letting the words sink in. Ewan acted out of a need to assert himself after decades of invisibility, but he was not alone in manipulating perception. Mrs. Calder, though not responsible for the act itself, ensured that the environment amplified the chaos, guiding reactions and maintaining control of the narrative. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was deliberate. Observing the micro-patterns, the twitch of a hand, a slight hesitation, a glance at the antlers, revealed the full truth. These were the breadcrumbs that led to understanding the crime entirely. The villagers nodded, some in relief, others in unease. The pattern, once hidden in the minutiae, was now visible. Hamish allowed a small, knowing smile. Justice had been served in the conventional sense, the murderer apprehended, the hidden accomplice exposed. Yet the village itself felt the echo of unfinished business, the knowledge that human cunning had nearly eluded detection at every turn. There was a tension in that victory, a reminder that subtlety and intellect could twist even the most carefully observed lives. Hamish returned to the guest house one final time, alone. He traced the line of the windows, the antlers, the welcome table. The evidence, the paper, the vial, the glasses, had all been catalogued, yet the memory of their significance lingered. Each tiny clue, each misalignment, had contributed to revealing not just who acted, but why, and how the killer thought. It was a lesson in patience, in observation, in reading the subtleties of human behaviour. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a blanket of white that concealed the paths of the past week. Hamish paused at the doorstep, feeling the crisp air on his face. Justice had been served, but the delicate balance of the village remained. Those who had observed, those who had acted, would carry the memory of manipulation and revelation with them. Some, perhaps, would remember the clever orchestration and wonder if the truth had been fully captured, or if one thread of the plan still lay hidden. Hamish smiled faintly, a mixture of satisfaction and wariness. The details never lie, he murmured to himself, brushing snow from his coat. Even when the actors change, the pattern remains. And as long as I notice, I stay one step ahead. The snow glistened under the moonlight, quiet and pristine. Justice had been served, but the shadows of subtlety lingered, a reminder that in Loch Dhu, even a seemingly small gesture could conceal a lifetime of intention, and that Hamish Macbeth would always be there to unravel it. Hamish walked slowly down the snow-covered lane, the footprints behind him already fading under the steady drift of fresh snow. Loch Dhu lay quiet, the houses shuttered, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, the village seemingly restored to its simple, peaceful rhythm. Ewan was in custody, Mrs. Calder's subtle manipulations were exposed, and the sequence of events that had led to Morag's death was fully revealed. Yet, as Hamish trudged along the icy path, he could not shake the sense that the story was not entirely finished, that one faint thread had escaped his grasp. The scrap of brown paper, now carefully stored at the station, seemed innocuous enough, yet in his mind it held a lingering mystery. He remembered the tiny annotations along its margins, scribbles and shorthand that had initially seemed like nothing more than an extension of Ewan's obsessive habits. But there had been a symbol, a small mark he had overlooked the first time, almost hidden in the folds of the paper, like a punctuation that didn't belong. A swirl, a loop, something that did not match Ewan's handwriting. Hamish had catalogued it as an afterthought, but now, in the quiet of the snowy lane, it nagged at him. He glanced back toward the guest house. Lights flickered from within, warm and inviting, but in the shadows near the doorway, he thought he saw a movement, too subtle to be sure, just a blur at the edge of perception. No one could have been there. He paused, listening to the wind whisper through the trees, the distant splash of water from the loch. Had someone been watching him leave, or was it just a trick of the light? Hamish's mind turned over the minor inconsistencies in the week's events, the missing strand of hair at the chemist's shop, The faint smear on the antlers, the misaligned glasses, each detail had been significant, yet each seemed to have layers he had not fully unravelled. Someone had orchestrated chaos in subtle ways, and while Ewan and Mrs. Calder accounted for the majority of the disruption, Hamish could not shake the feeling that a minor actor had slipped beneath the notice of the village and the authorities. As he continued along the lane, he noticed something else, a small envelope tucked between the folds of a fence post near the edge of the loch. He picked it up carefully, the paper stiff with frost. Inside was a single note, penned in a sharp, unfamiliar hand. "The game is never truly over. Watch closely." The words were simple, almost teasing, but the implication was clear. Another presence, another mind at work, perhaps waiting for the perfect moment to step forward. Hamish felt the familiar thrill that came with uncertainty, the way a detective senses the pulse of an unfinished case. He tucked the note into his coat, stepping over the frost-bitten grass, eyes scanning the horizon for any movement. The village seemed peaceful, yet the note reminded him that tranquility was often an illusion, easily disrupted by a clever mind with patience and intent. Even as he walked back toward his small cottage, the snow crunching underfoot, he reviewed the week in his mind. Each detail now made sense, each subtlety accounted for, but the swirl on the paper, the blurred shadow, the cryptic note, they lingered as questions without answers, threads that promised another puzzle in the quiet corners of Loch Dhu. Hamish smiled faintly. That uncertainty was the life of a detective, the assurance that the mind behind the crimes would always challenge him, would always leave a whisper of intrigue beyond the resolution. By the time he reached his door, the sky had turned a pale violet, the snow reflecting the last light of day. Inside, the warmth of the fire waited, comforting yet unassuming. Hamish set the note on the table beside his coat and kettle, his mind already circling the possibilities it suggested. The deadly winter welcome had ended, justice had been served, yet the faintest ripple of mystery remained, as if the village itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next shadow to move. Hamish Macbeth settled into his chair, hands folded, eyes thoughtful. The case had tested every ounce of his observation, patience, and reasoning, but the truth, like the snow outside, was never as simple as it seemed. Somewhere in Loch Dhu, another thread waited, another puzzle lingered, and he knew that his quiet village, with all its snow-laden streets and hidden corners, would call him again. For now he let the warmth of the fire seep into his bones, letting the faint hum of suspense settle in the back of his mind. A mystery never truly ends, he reminded himself, and as long as he noticed the subtle details, the micro-movements, the hidden signs, the faint whispers of intention, he would always be ready. Outside, the snow continued to fall, hiding footprints, blurring edges and veiling secrets. Inside, Hamish's mind was awake, tracing patterns, anticipating the next ripple in the calm. The deadly winter welcome had passed, but in the heart of Loch Dhu, a whisper remained, the game was far from over.